on. All right, so thank you everyone who joined us online today, and those who will be watching this recording later. So today is January 27th. We are meeting here for the first time in 2023. We'll correct that on the slide later, I guess. So is an oversight. So 2023. For the first MedicalXR Council meeting. Super exciting because we'll be setting some strategy stuff, but the most exciting piece here is we have new leadership. Dr. Julia Scott has joined us as the lead of the MedicalXR Advisory Council. So honestly, I just want to welcome all of you to the council on behalf of XRSI board. I personally stay involved to represent the XRSI board, as well as to bring my expertise to the council. And so don't want to do any more delay. We have a few observers that I want to name to the council today. We do have Dr. I believe, Jared Kutzin. Maybe I'm not saying the name correctly. We also have, let me see, Delilah, who is XRSI volunteer, would potentially assume an operations role at some point, but today Delilah will be shadowing me for notes taking, kind of running the slideshow, etc. And that's it. And we may have another observer join us, but so far I don't see them, so that's all right. And then we have a guest today. So I would, from here on, I would hand this over to Dr. Julia Scott. So Julia, please take it away.
Right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for making time today. And, it's new year, new initiatives, and planning to get the work done is kind of the approach I'm going to take. I think the year ahead of this has really done a lot of the explore work and figuring out where the priorities are and what can be done now. And then part of what I want to do today is get your input on what are other things that can be done next within the council we have here, and possibly identify other areas where we need to build out the council with different skill sets and experiences. So my intent is that with the conclusion of these discussions in month 1 and month 2, as a team, we have a clear vision of what we're going to be doing this year, and everyone's on board. So that's my take. I think I did my intro presentation last time, so I'm not sure if everyone knows all the other basics, kind of where I am. I'm at Santa Clara University in California. My focus is on brain health and XR applications in that context. So my lab within the healthcare program is brain and memory care lab. And I'm working on translating a component of what I do there into a usable product. So I kind of see both the research side and then the commercialization side on MedicalXR. So hopefully that experience will help shape what we're doing here as a team. All right. Okay. So what we have next on the agenda is Dr. Charles Binkley over at Meridian Health, and he has a broad level of experience in practicing medicine and in surgery and in the applied bioethics in medical care, and the integration of AI into that clinical decision-making process. So we'll have an opportunity to meet Dr. Binkley and learn about his work. That'll be the next thing we do. Then after that process, we'll use the second half of the meeting to do what I just described, of covering the standing priorities or items we have for the year, and then gather that additional group, additional ideas. And so for the brainstorming process, what I'd like to do is break us out into groups of 3 to share or like our first phase of ideas, and then come back together as a whole group to see where there is some consensus. So that's the overview for today. All right, so we can go, is there any questions before we move forward? Anything else to add to the agenda? Okay. All right, Dr. Binkley, are you feeling ready?
I am all ready, Julia.
Okay.
Can I share my screen?
Yes.
Let's see. Great. All right. I think everyone can see that. Is that right? Yes, great. All right, thank you. So thank you, Julia and Kavya, for the opportunity to be here today to potentially join the council and to tell you a little bit about my work. So I am a liver and pancreas cancer surgeon by training. I practiced for about 15 years, developed a cancer center in San Francisco, and then also ran the bioethics service. So I come at artificial intelligence, virtual reality, extended reality, very much from a clinical perspective as one who's practiced. And I also bring my background in bioethics. So I ran the bioethics consult service in San Francisco, and then about 3 years ago, transitioned into full-time bioethics. Spent a year with Julia at Santa Clara University. I was at the Markkula Center, which is a freestanding ethics center in Santa Clara, and then was recruited here to Hackensack Meridian. So we're a 14 hospital health system just outside New York City in New Jersey, extending from North New Jersey, like Bergen County, which is just adjacent to the Bronx, all the way down the Jersey Shore to near Cape May. So a really diverse area, diverse mix of patients and payers, and also a very interesting opportunity to be part of a health system that's just started a medical school. We have a medical school that's about 5 years old, and I'm an associate professor of surgery there in the medical school. So what I'm going to talk about today is really about what I think is the opportunity for AI technology, specifically in the area of surgery, as it applies to surgical decision-making. And the ability to make surgical decision-making better and to care for patients better. So what is patient selection for surgery? So we don't really think about what happens many times as a patient before you go to the operating room, but a surgeon will actually sit down and look through your medical record and find out if first of all, you have the indication for the operation, and then find out if you have the fitness in terms of your medical comorbidities. And the whole idea is that you want to do the most good and the least harm to people, the most good presumably being a result of the operation, and the least harm, also the operations can be both beneficial and harmful. All of medicine has the potential, just like AI, just like XR, has the ability to be useful, beneficial, but also has the potential to be harmful. And so what sways the balance one way or the other? And I think it's actually ethics. I think ethics provides the framework for swaying the balance in terms of the good and away from the less good manifestations or the less good applications of what we have, our tools. And so surgical decision-making is the process by which surgeons decide to offer a patient an operation. That's kind of the first step. And that's salient for clinical decision support system, because that's a collaboration first between the physician and the system before the patient is offered surgery. And then the second part of the decision-making process is the surgeon will offer the patient an operation, and they will engage in shared decision-making based on the patient's values and preferences to decide if this is an alignment before they proceed to the operating room. So what is the process? How do surgeons go about selecting patients? So it's, again, this estimate of benefit and burden, the risk of the estimate of the risk to the patient in terms of death, complications, injuries, functional impairment. You think about big cancer operations of the head and neck that might leave patients unable to swallow, unable to speak, blind in both eyes. And so those are the risks. And sometimes those risks are unintended, and sometimes that's part of the operation. It may involve removing the tongue, the vocal cords. For brain surgery, a portion of the brain, which can leave patients functionally impaired. And then what is the estimate? How likely is it to achieve the functional outcome? And this could be survival, it could be decreased suffering and improved function. So surgeons in general have had the ability to make these estimates independently by themselves. All of us are aware of our epistemic limitations. And so there have been other ways that surgeons have provided means of making these decisions slightly more objectively. And we'll talk about some of those and perhaps the opportunity for AI to make them even more objective. So surgeons estimate these risks, I think, in sort of 4 different categories. One is based on their epistemic authority, their training, their experience. The second is scoring systems. Again, that's the attempt to make these decisions slightly more objective. Some surgeons do this in response to metrics. Many of the metrics that are captured on surgeons in terms of operative time, morbidity, mortality, they're reported and they're part of the peer review process. They're also part of the credentialing process within hospitals. And for some hospitals, it's part of the hospital's reputation. And so surgeons sometimes can be very aware of their reputation, the reputation of the medical center that they work for based on their outcomes. And that may cause them to be more risk adverse than not when it comes to accepting patients. And again, this is an opportunity, I believe, for AI. And then there's also data extrapolation that's taking population-based data and extrapolating it to individual patients, which tends to be imprecise. And so if there were an opportunity to develop precision in that area, and again, this is a way which I think AI can interface with surgical decision-making. I just want to hone in on a couple of these to show their potential weakness and the opportunity for AI predictions, predictive analytics to improve. So the eyeball test is something that you'll hear surgeons in particular, but really lots of different specialties talk about. So you'll hear someone say, go and eyeball that patient and see how they look. So this is the idea, is that this is a gestalt. This is looking at the patient and saying, I think this patient will tolerate the operation, or I think this patient is too sick. So as you can imagine, there are all sorts of biases that come into this. So you're looking at one patient at one set of eyes on one patient at one period in time. And you can also imagine all the implicit biases that come into this. So if you take 2 patients with relatively the same risk factors, objectively, physiologically, but one patient is well-dressed, was driven to the hospital versus someone else who may have worked all night, who may have had to walk several blocks after public transportation to get to the hospital, who may not be as well-dressed, they're going to eyeball much differently, and that certainly influences surgical judgment when it comes to offering an operation or not. There's also quality of life considerations, which can be really very biased, and those can happen in a couple of ways. A surgeon can look at a patient, particularly a patient living with a disability, and say, this patient's life is their quality of life is so poor that there's nothing that I can do as a surgeon to improve their quality of life. And so they say, we're not going to offer this patient an operation. It can also be the future quality of life. So as a result of this operation, this patient's quality of life, it will be so poor that it doesn't justify me taking them to the operating room. And the issue here is that we are making assumptions about someone else's quality of life. And it's really only the patient, the lived experience of that quality of life, that can decide what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. And we have great empiric evidence to show that a patient may, in a period of time, say, I would find bilateral amputations unacceptable. And then there's some event and the patient has a bilateral amputation. They say, I'm so glad that I did this. I was able to compensate. I was able to adapt. I'm resilient, right? So there are all sorts of things that we think would be unacceptable until they actually happen to us. And then we adapt to them and they become acceptable. And we're glad that we did that. The issue is that we can make that decision for ourselves, and it's not somebody else saying that if I were to amputate both of the extremities of this patient, then they would be, their quality of life would be so poor, it's not worth doing this. And so really making sure that the patients make that decision and not the surgeons. This is a paper I published a couple of months ago in the New England Journal with a couple of colleagues, Andy Schumann from the University of Michigan and Joel Reynolds from Georgetown, in which we really looked at this and suggested that in terms of quality of life assumptions and disability assumptions, that perhaps, and I believe, that predictive analytics, AI clinical decision support systems will be better than surgeons in making some of these decisions. So in an attempt to make these decisions slightly more objective, surgeons have relied on scoring systems. And so one of the scoring systems that's commonly used is called the frailty score. And there are 5 or 6 different scoring systems that look at various parameters. So one is how far can someone walk? What is their grip strength? What is their ability to recall? How cognitively impaired are they? And you can see how these they could potentially be surrogate markers, but they may not be. They may actually be very biased. So someone who's living with a disability may not be able to walk, and so therefore they don't score well. Someone with a mild cognitive impairment may actually be very suitable for surgery, but they may fail part of the frailty test. And so you can see how, in an attempt to actually make these more objective, it may have backfired and actually made some of these assessments more biased. And so this is another paper that I wrote with my colleagues from the University of Michigan and from Georgetown. This author had postulated using frailty scores to make decisions in the neonatal intensive care unit about which neonates do and don't get life-sustaining treatments based on how frail they are at birth. And so we found this very problematic from many different perspectives, the least of which not being from a disabilities perspective. And then there's also race-associated risk and benefit. Again, this is not just implicit bias, but there's good data to suggest that Black patients die more commonly when they're taken to surgery and they have more complications. But it has nothing to do with being Black itself. It has everything to do with where they got the operation, what environment they were in, what epigenetic factors have influenced them and their outcomes. And so there is this tendency to extrapolate that data and to say that every Black patient that a surgeon sees is going to be higher risk for surgery, and therefore you take that into account to their Blackness, which really it's not true, right? It has nothing to do with their Blackness, but everything to do with all the other factors that surround the individual. And again, this is a place where some colleagues of mine and I believe that AI will actually do better and overcome some of these racial biases. Brandy Scully is a congenital heart surgeon at Boston Children's, and she's very interested in how some of these assumptions play out in deciding which neonates with congenital heart disease get surgery and which don't. And David Kemp is a professor, a law professor at Berkeley and at Rutgers, and also happens to be my husband, who's very interested in issues of race and equity. So how can surgeons improve patient-centered care, really? So in my mind, and in the mind of most, the way that this should go down is that the surgeon would make as accurate, as objective, and as personalized a prediction of risk and benefit for the patient. And then the patient would determine the value that they place on that, of the value on the benefit, the value of the risk, and they would determine the acceptable balance. And then the clinician and the patient would engage in shared decision-making. So how might surgeons more accurately, objectively make clinical predictions? And this is where I think there's a role for AI and predictive analytics. But what are some of the issues? And I know that probably everyone on the call could recite, some of these issues. These are things that are well discussed, well known, but how do they apply, particularly in this setting? And I'm not going to go through all of these for the sake of time, but I just want to hone in on 2 of them that I think are particularly relevant and that I'm particularly interested in. One having to do with clinical autonomy, and the other one having to do with patient consent. So thinking more generally about XR, I wrote this paper with Brian Green from Santa Clara University, looking at interoperative, so AI systems can be used in many different phases of surgical care. Patient selection is preoperative. There are also many systems that are being used intraoperatively. And he and I wrote this paper that was published in JAMA Surgery about some of the issues specifically about AI for intraoperative clinical decision support that affect the clinician. And so how will clinician autonomy potentially be affected as these systems are introduced? So it may be that there are expectations on the clinician to basically follow suit with what the prediction is from the AI system, particularly once, and I really believe that these systems will be adopted as the standard of care, which is sort of the gold standard. And so if the clinician and the system disagree, and the clinician does what the clinician believes to be right, and the patient is harmed, the clinician will almost certainly be liable for that. If the system makes a prediction and the clinician disagrees but goes on with the system, even if the patient is harmed, the clinician will unlikely to be liable because the clinician will follow the standard of care, and that's sort of the legal standard for torts. And so you can understand how these systems might affect clinical autonomy if they're accepted as the standard of care and there's disagreement between the clinician and the system. It may come that patients begin to expect that clinicians will use these systems for their own care, as well as payers and health systems may expect that these systems will be used. Payers may not reimburse unless those systems are moved. And then surgeons may become complacent. They may develop apathy, and they may simply roll over and accept the system without really questioning it because they feel like they're powerless otherwise. In terms of informing patients, in my mind, the agency of the physician is informing and explaining. It's what we do. We make decisions, making decisions, and then explaining them is what physicians do. And so I think about explaining and informing patients about the AI system and its participation in their care in three, potentially four different roles as the patient. So as the patient, patient should be informed. The patient is donor of their health information. In general, we believe, and we think about Henry Lax and the HeLax cells. So donations should be informed and voluntary. When you come into an academic medical center, if a medical student is part of your operation or part of your care, you're generally told that this is a medical student, this is a medical resident, a junior doctor. In general, we inform patients when they're learning subjects, and their participation as learning subjects is voluntary. And then certainly patients as research subjects, the participation is acknowledged to be informed and voluntary. So this is Laocoon for those of you who are students or admirers of Virgil. So Virgil in the Aeneid, the opening scene is Laocoon, a priest of Troy, standing up and warning the Trojans that the Greeks who have just brought the hollow horse into Troy, that it's filled with soldiers who are going to overtake Troy. And so he says, beware of Greeks and those bearing gifts. The serpent sent by the gods comes out of the sea and kills Laocoon and his two children. I do not want to be Laocoon. I am not trying to be Laocoon. I am not saying that these things are bad and clinicians need to be worried, beware of Greeks and those bearing gifts, beware of AI systems. I want to prepare us to think about these things before they're deployed so as to minimize harm and distrust on the part of clinicians and patients. So thank you for the opportunity to present. I appreciate it. I'm going to stop sharing, and then if there are any questions or discussions, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Dr. Binkley. That was really informative and provides a great framework to understand how you approach the decision-making process and evaluate the different ways to evaluate it would be whether or not to operate, not what the operation is at this point, but this discussion of who gets that service and who doesn't, right? Yeah, so that's something all of us may face one day as well. It's very real. Does anyone have any questions that come to mind for Dr. Binkley? I have a few, but let's open it up to the group first.
Dr. Binkley, I will ask tons of questions around this, but the very first thing that sort of comes to my mind is what's the direct intersection XR AI that you see that would have the potential impact? The one that comes to my mind, and this is popping up everywhere in these virtual worlds, the embodied AI. Potentially, and maybe how do some of the AI ethics that you're absolute expert of could potentially translate to that sort of a phenomena? So what is that direct, bridge, and then how could that potentially translate?
I think it's a great question. I actually just submitted an open peer commentary this morning, a proposal for an open peer commentary on asking the question, is conversational AI a tool or an agent? And so I come at this slightly more philosophically, because I think about, what is the agency of embodied AI? Is it an agent, or is it a potential agent? Is it a manifestation of an incomplete potential agent? And so what is the agency of an embodied AI? So I think the important thing there to think about, and the most common application of embodied AI right now is in mental health. And I had the privilege of giving a grand rounds in the psychiatry department a couple of weeks ago. And so I got to really delve fairly deeply into embodied AI in the mental health arena. So I think the important thing there is that these embodied AI chatbots, whatever they happen to be, they're not therapists, right? So the whole debate is, is this a therapist? And then are they, what ethics, what ethical framework should we think about as embodied AI is introduced? So I think they're more like a friend or a companion, right? So this is not a patient relating to a therapist. This is a human being relating to embodied AI. And so there's this huge concern that these therapeutic boundaries will be blurred, but I think they're more dissimilar than they are similar. And I think most patients can differentiate those in a meaningful way. So I think that, I think we get a little hung up on trying to figure out, are these therapists, rather than sort of looking at the characteristics, and saying, what is this most like? And then based on the relationship, based on the human AI, human XR relationship, what is this relationship most like in the world today? And so what ethical repercussions does that have? So what ethical requirements are there on that relationship? And so at least in the mental health sphere, I think things like I think it's Weebot, or what is the Meta has the embodied AI? It's
Wobot.
Wellbot, yeah, Woebot, yes. So when I think about Woebot's relationship, it's not the relationship between a therapist. It's really the relationship between a conversational aid and a person. And so I think that the ethical sort of framework to apply there is very much a companion, a friend, a trusted companion, in which you wouldn't you wouldn't cause unintended harm or suffering, to the individual. And so I think it's going to cause us to think more deeply about our relationships in society, and what's the assumed ethical framework that we apply to all of our relationships.
Right. I was hoping to get your input on something more, on a topic more tangible, on the interoperative applications of XR, especially with Magic Leap just getting the approvals for that usage, and what are the key things to consider there, and possible harms and benefits.
Yeah, it's a great question, Julie. And I thought about this a lot after our panel presentation at the XR Safety Week. So one of the things that struck me most about one of the presenters was talking about using this for remote surgery, for potentially allowing a surgeon who is not trained, for instance, say in neurosurgery. So I'm a liver and pancreas cancer surgeon, and so say that I'm in a remote area, a patient comes in with head trauma and needs some sort of emergent neurosurgical procedure that would be life-saving. And so I have my headset on, and there's a neurosurgeon at Columbia in New York who's going to take me through the operation. So if everything turns out great, if I'm able to do the procedure, save the patient's life, fantastic. If the patient is going to die and the patient dies in the process, then the patient's died. But if I kill the patient, being as well-intended as I am, having the expert on the other side, if I kill the patient as a result of my good intention but bad outcome, am I morally capable? Am I ethically culpable? And am I legally bound? So that's the part that I don't know. And so I may have related, I had this experience of operating in Africa. again, liver and pancreas cancer surgeon. So I'm operating in on the Uganda border. Birds are flying overhead during surgery, to give you an idea. It was primitive. And someone brought a laboring woman in a wheelbarrow and parked her outside of the operating room. So I had not delivered a baby since I was a medical student. I had never done a C-section. And I had to look at this poor woman and ask, am I better than nothing? What do I do?
Question.
Yeah, knowing that I would potentially kill her. I would potentially kill her on the table from not knowing what I was doing. And so what is that gap? What is that knowledge gap? And can XR fill it? I think that's the first question. So I think we would have to prove that, particularly for remote surgery. I mean, the idea that, this is going to, you just do it. I think we have to think very carefully about putting these tools in people's hands that could be both immensely beneficial and also immensely harmful. So part of the role of an ethicist is to look for unintended, unforeseen, harmful outcomes. That's sort of how we spend a lot of our ethical life, is looking at things and saying, this is the best, this is the worst, this is the most likely, but the worst is really where we try to think about the unintended negative outcomes. And so that's sort of what I think about in this space in terms of intraoperative using XR or virtual reality intraoperatively for assistance. I think there's some great learning opportunities for thinking about, before residents start practicing on humans. I think that could be very interesting. I think there may be some ethical concerns in terms of evaluating the resident. So, what if you find in these settings, in these simulated settings, that the resident is really not very talented? I mean, we don't test people's technical skills before we admit them to surgery residency. We test their cognitive skills, but we really don't see if people have a steady hand, if they have good eye-hand coordination. So I'm thinking about a system that we're deploying here at Hackensack that's theoretically able to look at an intraoperative kinetics of a robot and predict the likelihood of the patient will have complications. So we've typically thought of complications as patient's determinant, right? So this is really a new way of thinking about this. Are complications as much surgeon determinative as they are patient determinative?
Yeah, for some reason, having not gone to medical school myself, I thought the selection of surgeons did evaluate their motor skills. The process doesn't. Okay.
No, I mean, never. I mean, being on, I'm on the admissions committee at our medical school, and I was on the admissions committee for I did my residency at the University of Michigan. And no, we never ever thought about technical skills. And then the first day of, we look at people's, their scores on step 1 of the boards. We look at their grade point averages, their feedback from their rotations. And then literally the first day of residency, I showed up and they said, go to OR3 and scrub with Dr. Burney. And, I did a herniorrhaphy my first day of residency. And, and I approached it much differently. I was a little bit older. I'd had this background in the classics and humanities and philosophy. And I thought, gosh, what if I hurt this person? And you do kind of have to get over that a little bit. Yeah, it is. There's a bit of epistemic humility that goes into this, and also a bit of, I think, hubris.
Right. Okay. Kavya, shall we move on to the next step on the agenda?
I believe so. Yeah,
Okay.
Julia, in the
interest of time,
we have 20 minutes left. So let's do that. Yeah.
Okay. So this is where we're just checking if there's any objections to onboarding Dr. Binkley.
Personally, I'm just like, hey, we're pretty delighted to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is one of the intersections where without Dr. Binkley's help, we would be weaker on this side. And this is a huge intersection that MedicalXR Council should explore. The same motion would be sent out via the email as well. So there will be time to say anything outside of this meeting as well.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll, it's time to think about that. I think the next thing we want to make sure we cover, Kavya, is kind of the initiatives that are on the table for this year. And so I think if we can share the information on those together, we'll be able to cover the full ground on that. Delilah, can you put the agenda back on the screen? Thank you. All right. So the first item in progress is work with NHS, which is working on adapting the DTAC to consider the additional components of a digital health application in XR. And Kavya, on that, may you share what the current status is at this moment and what we need to bring in to help them?
For sure. And thanks, Julia. So one thing that I want to actually, because Sarah, you're here, Sarah Hill, we have two Sarahs on the council, with the suggestions that you were making about potentially coming up with some kind of actionable guidance, etc., could be very in line with what this work is, which is updating digital technology assessment checklist and helping that to become a global standard. We talked about this during Metaverse Safety Week with Dr. Neil Ralph and Dr. Ross O'Brien from WISA. And that's what the work is. I'm going to reconnect with Neil and get that sort of, potentially in writing. Currently, they're conducting survey to get a state of the art of this particular scope. And then we are going to help them add the privacy, safety, etc. perspective from the XR perspective. And potentially the refurbished checklist will be shared widely. And that's where, Sarah, your suggestion would really come in handy. Could we take that potential checklist and hand it over to the ecosystem, the stakeholders? And that would be useful. So now would be a great time to then connect with people who may have some perspective to add to this DTAC, because there is already a bit of a baseline there. Julia, I can move on to the next item as well, if that's cool.
Yeah.
Metaverse Safety Week wise, we did the Metaverse Safety Week 10th to 15th of December. Only one day of the Metaverse Safety Week was dedicated to MedicalXR. But if there are any potential organizations that want to adopt the week and then really just take it all 5 days to dedicate to healthcare, that's, because it's a campaign and that campaign can be used in whichever ways. So just wanted to put that forward, that those kinds of options exist. And any suggestions on how the Metaverse Safety Week 2023 could be best utilized, what type of conversations do we want to have? We can start to think about that early on, and how many days do we want to dedicate to medical or MedicalXR, etc. One other thing, which is the next agenda item, next point mentioned here, is advisory consultation for MXR focused organization. And I think this is in tandem with, once we have DTAC, we potentially want to offer MedicalXR Council's expertise to organizations that really need help with. And there are several that are reaching out. So I don't know what the business model or things would look like, but this is something that we should discuss in our brainstorm. And finally, what kind of next steps we want to take with MedicalXR privacy safety framework. Currently, we just have the phase 1 study done. It's not quite complete. It needs to be reviewed again from various different perspectives, from the risk perspective, as well as from some of the intersections that were kind of lacking, the AI intersections, the brain-computer interface intersections, those kind of things. Yep. So those are the few updates so far. Nothing too concrete, but really looking forward to gathering thoughts and ideas, brainstorm, kind of what should we be doing in 2023?
Right. That's the big question today, of where to take action this year. So we have about 15 minutes. And so I'd like to use half that time to break out into small groups for us to share with each other what's on our minds, or on those points that are there, how can they expand out, or being more specific on what you think can be done. And then we'll come back after those 6 minutes and take notes and tabulate what we want to share. Okay. Does that sound good?
How many groups, Julia, do you want it? Like 2?
3 groups.
2 groups. Okay. I could be in one and then potentially you could be in another one. What do you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If we do 3
Delilah,
groups.
let's organize it that way then.
Yeah, I'm going to organize. Give me a second.
Yeah. So when the join rooms pops up, if you haven't seen it before, you just pick one of the rooms. It'll have a certain number of slots.
Should we pause recording during this time, Delilah?
For during the breakout time?
Yeah.
I
During
think
when it doesn't record the breakout rooms. It only records the main rooms.
Yeah. So it would just be empty.
okay.
Oh,
So,
okay.
Okay, good. All right. Awesome. Okay, so we've got 2 minutes. So we can quickly tabulate what was shared in just like one sentence. And if Delia, can you write them down either on the slide or just somewhere that we can share later? That'd be really helpful. Okay.
In fact, Julia, real quick, the one thing that we established that this exercise is needed. So we'll curate like a mural that can be circulated together with the meeting of minutes with all the members with different sections where they could actually suggest these are the people I recommend, these are the research items I believe is important for the council, etc. So we'll circulate it with minutes of meetings so they can kind of
I was thinking the same
offline.
thing.
Everything that was said was very similar. It's like we need to set objective for 2023, and there were some other stuff that I noted down. So we'll do that. Make sure that Delilah and I send out that.
Yeah, and this sets the seed to do that. So it's always easier to start from a list of 5 things and make 50 things than a blank list. So Kelly, what could you share really quick what you were highlighting about public facing aspect of this?
Yeah, I think that, the idea that we can do some kind of checklist is huge. And I think we can expand upon that as well by looking into specific communities, like on the entrepreneurial communities from accelerators to everywhere from universities, because what happens is if you don't have the right expertise on your team early on, people will build the wrong thing and oftentimes have to backtrack. So I think for XRSI to have some sort of presence there is really important, where there is a startup guide, I think is really critical for how to think about ethics and safety in health and wellness. And then building on that, I think there's an opportunity for our organization to put together an educational course and potentially certification program where individuals, whether they work in healthcare or at a company, can get the basics of safety and ethics, what initiatives are out there, how to leverage them, what to do for an organization so that we can increase baseline knowledge in this space. And that would give us a really great platform moving forward.
Valentino? Was there anything you wanted to share?
Yes, we were one of the most important aspects that we're discussing is how to increase the accessibility to the Metaverse Safety Week. Because of course, now there are a lot of changes from health space to new virtual spaces, but this is another problem. But of course, we should consider that we want to reach a broader and a vast audience. So is organizing the entire event in virtual spaces always the best choice? Or can we also follow other kind of solutions, other kind of way of organizing the events to be more inclusive and more accessible to people? Our idea, just to be sure, maybe we can also add some things in the document, is that what is the added value of virtual reality, of immersive worlds, is interactions, is relationships. So probably organizing some events, we can say online and Zoom or YouTube, could be more inclusive for the sessions. but we can organize virtual sessions right after or before to help people connect with the speakers and have, beyond discussions or deeper discussions after the sessions. So this was just a brainstorming idea, but we can elaborate it a little bit more after.
And then Oliver, would you like to share?
What we were saying on the other team was, or at least for me, was to move things. I am unmuted, right? Is to reason a little bit by objectives, basically. For me, that would be. So the idea of exactly as you would in a clinical setting, you would have short-term, long-term, medium-term objectives, and that would be kind of the first step for me to give some kind of abstract meaning to the process moving forward, and then gradually get more granular on what to do.
All right. So more about the process of how we're setting the objectives and clarifying that.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I checked the participant list and it looks like some of our members need to leave right at 10. So was there so I don't have more to go through. Is there anything else critical the group would like to add? Okay. All right. So Kavya and Dalia will compile this and post it, format it a little bit more so that we can process that over the next weeks and have more of a concrete plan at our next meeting.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
You're muted, Kavya.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good weekend. Bye-bye.
Nice to meet you guys.
Good weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.